Okay, welcome to this session, Prosperity for All, Can Britain Afford to Leave Europe? I'm Ellie Reeves and I'm Vice Chair of Labour's National Executive Committee. We have got a fantastic panel here today. Seema Malhotra, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Wes Streeting, who is on the Treasury Select Committee and fantastically won the seat of Ilford North from the Tories in the election, so well done Wes. John Park, the Assistant General Secretary at Community Union, and Andy Bagnall, who has held a wide range of jobs within the Labour Party over the years, but is now the Director of Campaigns at the CBI. I want there to be plenty of time for discussion and debate, so I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for no longer than 5 minutes each. Then we will open it up to discussion, asking the speakers to sum up at the end. So, without further ado, we will start with Seema.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ellie, and it's great to be here at Progress this morning and to open this session today. I want to start by saying this, which is that I see this decision, as I'm sure that many of us in here do, as probably the most important decision that we are going to make, not just for today, but for generations to come. And it is at this moment when I wake up and think, where are we? The fact that we are less than 6 weeks to go to that decision, and the fact that it's sort of ended up in this Punch and Judy show where so much is about the Tories versus the Tories, I think is doing a massive disservice to this debate and not providing the information that people need to make the decisions. There is something that's very important about the context as well, which is the way the world is changing. The way the world is changing in terms of our economy, and look, we've seen the slowdown just in the UK. We saw this at the time of the autumn statement. We've seen it at the time of the budget. Business investment coming down, public sector investment in our economy coming down, productivity going down, average wage growth being revised down. That was all without the threat of Brexit. So you can see when you've got the Bank of England standing up and the IMF standing up, the CBI standing up, many others standing up saying that there's going to be a huge cost to our economy. It's really important that we listen. But there are other more kind of important issues behind the scenes as well. When it comes to thinking about the long-term needs of our economy, what this debate is really about, which often go unnoticed in this debate. And I want to focus on two important aspects for me, some points that I made in a speech a few weeks ago as well. The first being about what this could mean for young people today, if we particularly make the wrong decision. And the second being what we should be thinking about in terms of the conditions for success, the factors that are going to be really important for the success of our economy in the future. This debate has to fundamentally be about how we're going to ensure a prosperous and secure future for all our people, and particularly the young who are going to live with the consequences of our choice for the longest. We should be looking at how, for our economy, we're creating the maximum number of jobs, better jobs, and how we're going to ensure that we've got those jobs for the future. And we should be recognising the benefits to our economy of EU-wide cooperation and what that can bring. We're far too focused on a very narrow view about businesses here today and trying to sustain the world of today. And I think we've learned that if all you do is try and focus on sustaining today, you are absolutely not going to win the arguments for tomorrow. And in thinking about how do we focus on what we need to achieve tomorrow, I want to focus on one key area, and that is around science and research and development. And I want to illustrate that to start with somebody who inspires me every day, and that's Tim Peake. He's up in space, and he's doing what he's doing, in large part due to the cooperation we have across the European Union. The European Space Agency, a significant proportion of its funding comes from the European Union. When we look at the collaboration that's needed to do something that is focused on the future, doing that research and development that's going to further our industry, that's going to further our medical science, that's going to further our environmental science and our understanding, produce those answers. How are we going to create the vaccines of the future for the diseases that we have today? Those areas of progress, they're not achieved by one nation alone. They're not achieved by one scientist working in one university. They are achieved by collaboration. And what we have seen in these areas, whether that is in science, investment, in medical progress, it is by scientists being able to work together across boundaries. And it is by being able to have the collaboration of the best minds that we see that progress. So it's no surprise that you see the majority of UK scientists, led by Stephen Hawking, saying that it would be against our interests as scientists and against our interests in terms of our universities and our economy that we leave the European Union. I also want to focus on what that means from the point of view of our innovation pipeline. We won't see our industries of the future being created and being competitive in the world of tomorrow if we don't work in partnership with our scientists and our universities for the industry of tomorrow, for the progress on renewable energy, the progress, as I mentioned, in medical science, but also in terms of using technology like technology to deal with issues like drug and alcohol rehabilitation. The tech industry, so dependent on the digital single market, not just the single market as we know it today in the way we think about trade, but where that industry is going to be for tomorrow, making sure that we have the chance for our innovators, our entrepreneurs, and our tech entrepreneurs of today. 400 billion euro a year is what the digital single market is set to be worth. And if we want to have a chance for our tech entrepreneurs of today, the young people like Tom Jennings, who I met in Salford a few weeks ago, those people who know that overnight their businesses can become global because of the opportunities that the EU offers. If we want to have a secure future for them and the opportunities for all of them to innovate, we know we've got to stay in the European Union. So I'll close my remarks with this, which is that the vote leave will give you the impression that there is no baby that we throw out with the bathwater. We have to be the ones who are challenging the myths being peddled. We have to be the ones who are standing up saying, if we want to have a secure future for our young people, where they understand and they're here and they want to vote 3-1 to stay in, if we want to be creating an environment and an economy where they've got a chance and their best chance for a future, which is comparable, if not better, to their counterparts in 27 other European nations, we should not be disadvantaging them from the people that they are going to have to compete with in the future. And if we want to say that as a nation we are going to stand up on the world stage, be a nation that looks forward, not back, be a nation that is opening its doors and not closing them, being a nation that is proud of its role on this world stage and not retreating to being Little England. It is time we woke up. It is time we recognised the risk to not just today, but to the Britain of the future if we vote to leave the European Union. Thank you.
Thanks, Seema, and some really good points there about science, innovation and technology. Lots for us to think about when we're talking to people about the case for Europe. Wes, over to you.
Well, that's actually Councillor Wes Streeting MP, and I think I should point that out and join the chorus of calls for Richard Angel's head for this disgraceful omission from the conference agenda. looking at the essay question, I'm sure it's the same for the other two sessions as well. Can Britain afford to leave Europe? No, not really, and I'm sure there's consensus across the panel and much consensus in the room. So I think we're probably better off focusing on the time we've got between now and a referendum, which is a referendum that I think we're at serious risk of losing, and one of those instances where the polls are absolutely right, and I think the Labour Party will be the difference as to whether we bring this referendum home and keep Britain in Europe or see us divorce in a way that will be most painful for the parts of the country that we represent, and ironically, the parts of the Labour vote that are most inclined to vote to leave the European Union. And we've got to acknowledge that in spite of all of the effort that's been done to set up Labour in and to lay the groundwork, we really are beginning with a standing start with this referendum, and unless I'm missing something, and the experience I've seen on the doorstep in my part of London and other places I've been to, I'm not sure this surge in membership has necessarily led to a surge in activism. So sorry guys, I know you've got blisters and they're probably not yet fully healed, mine haven't gone, but we've got a job to do and we've got to get out there and do it, not least because the question of who the public trust tells us something quite worrying about the state of politics. And it's good to see John Park from my trade union community and Andy Bagnall from the CBI on the platform, because what all of the evidence says is that the voices of business leaders and trade union leaders are the most respected and trusted in this debate, and we need to make sure that they are at the forefront of our campaign and of the arguments that we're making on the doorstep. One of the ironies I felt when I was attacking David Cameron over his tax affairs a month or so ago, or at least his unwillingness to be upfront about his tax affairs, was that he's meant to be leading the campaign to keep Britain in Europe, but he fundamentally isn't trusted, and the blue-on-blue attacks aren't helping. I thought Jeremy Corbyn's speech on the European Union was actually one of Jeremy's speeches I could genuinely applaud, not just because he was making the case to keep Britain in the European Union, but he did it in an authentic way as someone with a Eurosceptic track record and someone who doesn't pretend that it's perfect, but that we would be cutting off our nose to spite our face we leave, and his voice is important. But at a time when I don't think that political leaders are enormously trusted, and in spite of the whatever gloss you want to put on the relative leadership ratings, it's still the case that all leaders, including ours, still have deficit ratings on their leadership. So it really is up to us to get the voice of business across, and the voice of workers. And as part of that, I think the challenge on the doorstep is how we take some really big numbers, like the 3 million jobs that are linked to Britain's membership of the European Union, or the £36 billion black hole in the public finances that would follow from leaving, or the amount of trade we do with Europe, the impact on our GDP. How do you boil that down into a way that people really understand and think about in terms of their day-to-day impact? My dad is a Tory voting, working class Eurosceptic, always has voted Tory and always will, and he's voting to keep Britain in the European Union because he works for Nissan. And although he sells cars for a living rather than makes them, it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to imagine that impact on jobs of Nissan in Sunderland will impact on jobs of Mark in Essex. And so I think we do need to try and link those really big macroeconomic questions to people's day-to-day experiences. The truth is that if we did leave the European Union, this country isn't about to descend into the depths of despair and never to be seen again on the world stage. Britain does have a lot going for it, and we would survive. But the difference is, and in terms of the choice that voters face, is do you want the country to be more prosperous in the future, or do you want it to be less prosperous than it could be? And that gap between the enormous potential that the European Union has to offer us and the path that we'd be on if we left is that in order to succeed, it would lead to the race to the bottom in terms of pay, in terms of working conditions, in terms of the types of job that our economy competes on, particularly internationally. And so for our voters in particular, it's not just about individual jobs, it's also about what kind of country do you want to live in, what kind of jobs do you aspire to, not just for yourselves but for your children, and how serious do you take this choice. And my sense from talking to voters in my own constituency, which is one of those where we're kind of going 50-50 on whether we leave or remain, is that people are taking it seriously. They do want to listen to the arguments, they do want to have a conversation about the European Union, but they are sceptical, and many of those voters who are inclined to remain in the European Union are sceptical. This isn't a time for us to hedge our bets. It's no good worrying about whether we're going to share debates with the Tories or not. We actually have to just get stuck into this campaign. And I know there are some people, some of my colleagues even, that say, oh, hang on a minute, our Labour vote in my area is a Brit Eurosceptic. We are doing people a real disservice. We don't really attack this debate with every ounce of energy that we've got between now and the end of June. So no time to put your feet up, no time for relaxing, no time to go on holiday. We've got a job to do.
Thanks, Wes. Thanks, Wes. A really motivational speech about getting out there and campaigning for us to remain in Europe. OK, John, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm on the Stronger In campaign board in Scotland, and there's a few people who were on the other side of the referendum debate in Scotland a couple of years ago, and it's really nice to see them deploying the arguments that we deployed at that time now in terms of the European debate, and it's a huge challenge for us. Let's be clear about that. And what I wanted to say this morning was that actually try and lay out how big that challenge is from a trade union perspective, and try to get people to understand that this is a massive issue for us. And if we, as Wes says, if we don't get this right, this is going to have a huge impact, not just now, but in the future as well. So there are some serious issues there. There are some serious issues about the message that we need to get out, and there are some massive challenges that we need to take on. I think the problem is, and I'll give you a trade union perspective, I'll also give you a Scottish perspective on things. I think the problem is that this is a mind, not a heart campaign. So on balance, people will look at this and say, right, okay, remaining part of the EU is a good thing, and it's a non-balanced decision. Most of our constitutional debates, particularly the debate we had in Scotland a couple of years ago, was about how people felt. It was about their heart, it was about their families, it was about their heritage, it was about how they felt in their day-to-day life. And that's a much easier sell. And it's a massive problem for us right now that we have to sell a message which is about how people, not how they feel, but what the implications are of not being in the EU. I'm quite heartened, I've got to say. I mean, if you have a look at the people who are lining up on the other side of the argument, you know, when I used to play football at school and you'd pick your team, who's in goals and all this sort of stuff, you wouldn't pick Boris Johnson, you wouldn't pick Michael Gove, you wouldn't pick George Galloway. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, the people on the other side of the argument, the message carriers, they're not, you know, they're polarising at best. That's what I would say. They divide opinion. And I think in this debate, that's a huge issue because people who are carrying the message are the ones who decide whether people are going to turn out and vote, and you know, on when it comes to the day on 23rd of June, whether people are going to get off their backside and go to the local school, the local community centre, to vote the way that we want them to vote. So I think that is one of the key issues here. So we, on our side, we've seen Gordon Brown this week coming out. We had Barack Obama saying some very positive things. We had Donald Trump come out and saying some positive things from the other side of the spectrum. So we've got some, you know, good people on our side of the argument, and I think that's important. In terms of message carriers, what I'd want to say as well, there's an issue about trade unions and where trade unions are positioned on this. Trade unions, certainly most trade unions for the last 15 years, haven't been clear about where they were in the EU, where they stood in the EU. In fact, most decision makers haven't been clear in the EU. That's part of the problem that we've got. We've never really made a virtue of what our role is in the European Union. And I think that is a big issue. I'm hugely critical of the trade union movement for 4 years and 11 months, criticising the Labour government, and then the month before the election telling other members to go and vote for the Labour government. It's quite difficult. That's the same in the EU referendum just now. We've not had anyone saying anything really positive about the EU over a period of time, and now we are expecting the trade unions and their members to go and vote in a certain way. It's pretty challenging, and we have to be honest about that. And I think that is something that from community's perspective, that we recognise that. We've been speaking to our members, and the vast majority of them recognise that the EU plays some sort of positive role They're not sure what it is. I'm not sure if they're completely convinced that it means that they have a right to holidays, or their pensions protected, or the conditions are transferred over if they change employer. But at the same time, I think there's some really serious concerns about the role of the EU, and the trade union movement has a role to play in this debate. I'm worried that we're coming to it too late, if I'm being honest. We speak for 6.5, 7 million people, whether we're going to engage with them properly, whether we're going to have a meaningful discussion and convince our members to do something, which everybody in this room, I hope, understands is the right decision. I'm not convinced we can do that, and that's a problem. And actually, it's a problem in the Labour Party as well, if we're being honest. I think the EU has been damned by faint praise just now in the Labour Party, the leadership of the Labour Party, and we need to be honest about that as well. How the political capital that the leadership had over the last 6 or 7 months wasn't used effectively to carve out, I think, a deal on the trade union bill, for example, or other things that are coming down the road from the Tory government in exchange for support in the EU referendum. How that wasn't agreed, or that wasn't delivered, I don't know how, and it worries me for this, not just for this referendum, but the future of the Labour Party more generally. I'm sorry to be too candid about these things. I want to be positive about where we're going, but we do have a massive challenge here, and it's a challenge certainly my organisation is up for. And I think in saying that, and finishing on this point, if you, as individuals, as collectively, as trade unions, have a positive thing to say, constructive things to say, if you cut through, as community is on the steel industry right now, where they're seen as not just somebody that represents the workforce, but actually as a commentator on the industry, somebody that's got something to say, something about the industry, I think then at that point you're seen as credible in wider debates, particularly around the EU and other things. And that's a lesson for the trade union movement. Shouting from the rooftops, having less than credible arguments about lots of things, which we do from time to time, does not mean that we could then go and have a sensible discussion about big decisions like this, or represent our members effectively in big decisions like this. So there is a lesson about a trade union approach in this EU referendum as well. I just hope when it comes to the 24th of June that we're in a place to actually have a discussion about how we shape the EU in the future, and not one about how we then remove ourselves from the EU and what that looks like.
Thanks, John, and I think it's really useful to get a trade union perspective on the debate. Okay, so finally, over to Andy.
Thanks very much, Ellie. As Wes said, it's a panel where 4 people are all agreeing the answer to the question. I'm sure most of the audience does as well, but I'll try and give you a specifically business perspective in terms of answering that question: can the UK afford to leave the EU? I think we'd certainly pay a high price, is the simple answer. It wouldn't bankrupt us. The United Kingdom is a strong economy. We could certainly survive outside the EU. But the best route to jobs, to growth, to prosperity is remaining inside the European Union. And that's certainly the view, the overwhelming view of the majority of businesses. My own organisation, the CBI, the Confederation of the British Industry, we represent 190,000 businesses, small, medium, large, across all sectors of the economy. Our direct members employ about 7 million people, a third of the private sector workforce. We've asked them a couple of times about this question over the last 3 years and got a pretty consistent answer that 80% of them would prefer to remain in the European Union. In fact, those arguing to leave has gone down from 10% to 5% over the last couple of years. And it isn't just the CBI that's saying this. Sometimes we're characterised wrongly as the voice of bigger business, but it isn't just the CBI saying that. ADS, the aerospace trade body, SMMT, the automotive trade body, Tech UK, all of them return survey results in the 70% mark for staying in. Similarly, the IOD, the British Chambers of Commerce, about 2 to 1. And in fact, even the Federation of Small Businesses, a majority want to remain. It is closer, but don't let anybody tell you that small businesses somehow want to leave. They don't. The surveys show that a majority wishes to stay. Why does business feel this way? Why do businessmen and women want to remain? And the answer broadly is quite simple. It's access to the single market. A market of 500 million consumers with one common set of rules makes it much easier to do business. Yes, British firms exporting to our European partners, but also, of course, making it easier to import. Modern trade is very complex in terms of supply chains. That 500 million strong market is also an important component in the UK's attractiveness to foreign direct investment. It's an attractive prospect. Anyway, the United Kingdom, we have the English language, the English legal system, a lucky time zone, but having that access, unfettered access to 500 million consumers is an important component of American wholesale banks, Japanese car firms, many others choosing to invest in the United Kingdom as a gateway to that wider European market. And the size of the single market, that 500 million block, also helps us in terms of trade deals with third country markets. Being part of a block of 500 million allows the EU to stand toe-to-toe in trade negotiations in a world with countries the size of continents like India, China and the United States. So for a variety of reasons, being part of a bigger economic block is something that's attractive to business. And it's important to remember it's not just about what's good about the EU and for some what's bad about the EU, and of course there are drawbacks, we shouldn't be blind to those, but this isn't a referendum on whether we like the EU or don't like it. It's a choice of two futures for the United Kingdom, one inside the EU and another outside. And looking at what it might look like outside is again a reason that the business community supports remaining in. The price of leaving and developing an alternative relationship might be quite considerable. If the country does vote to leave on June the 24th, the Prime Minister has made it clear that within days he would trigger Article 50, which is the clause in the Treaty for the European Union that allows a member state to depart. What happens when you trigger Article 50 is a 2-year ticking clock is started to give a period of negotiation for two agreements, one to withdraw from the European Union and the other a continuation agreement to determine the new relationship. 2 years is an incredibly short period of time to negotiate a trade deal, particularly one on the level of complexity we would be talking about. The average is about 5.5 years. To extend that 2-year period of negotiation requires unanimity amongst the 27 remaining member states. And it won't just be trade we'll be discussing. Every political issue between the UK and those other 27 states would be on the table. Spain might take the opportunity to raise Gibraltar, just as one example of the complexity that negotiation might have involved in it. If there isn't a deal after 2 years, and if there isn't an agreement to extend that period, the UK just automatically leaves the European Union without a continuation deal, which means trading under WTO, World Trade Organization rules. For CBI members, that's a deeply unattractive place to be. It means the return of tariffs, 10% on our automotive exports, the cars that Mr. Streeting Senior is selling, that Nissan produced up in Sunderland, 20% on Scotch whisky, one of our strongest exports, up to 50% on some of our manufactured food products. Again, people might not know manufactured food is our strongest manufacturing subsector. So WTO relationship with the European Union would be deeply, deeply unattractive. One way in that could be avoided is by taking an off-the-peg solution. You might hear it in the debate referred to as the Norway option, which means joining the European Economic Area. From a business perspective, that probably is the next best thing because Norway does enjoy almost complete access to the single market, give or take some VAT issues and some rules of origin admin at the customs border. But the problem with the Norway option for those arguing to leave is it doesn't solve any of the problems that are normally held up as issues with our membership of the European Union. Norway still pays the bills, it's the 10th highest contributor to the EU budget per capita, it follows the vast majority of single market rules, but it has no influence over making those rules because it doesn't have a commissioner or seats in the European Parliament and so on. And it also, as part of the package, part of the deal to get access to the single market, accepts free movement of people. So it's very unlikely that the Norway solution would be politically palatable, even if it is economically probably the next best thing. Which would leave the United Kingdom looking to negotiate some form of free trade agreement. Again, you'll hear it talked about as the Swiss model in the debate, or perhaps Canada is a country that we should emulate. It's worth just saying this. There are lots of drawbacks. Both those countries have only partial access to the single market. They have no influence over the rules, over the terms of trade, and it also takes a hugely long time, as I've said, to negotiate a trade deal. Switzerland took 16 years to get to the current arrangements that it has with the European Union. The Canadian deal is signed but not ratified. It's at about 7.5 years, might be another year before it comes into force. The new relationship that we do ultimately negotiate is going to be the determinant of the scale of the economic shock of leaving, that in answering the question, the price that we pay in order to leave. My own organisation has done some modelling, but there's lots of other economic models out there which all point in the same direction. We modelled a couple of scenarios which suggested the cost per household might be somewhere in the range of, in a best case scenario, £2,100 worse off per household against the counterfactual remaining, to maybe as much as £3,700 per household. Again, between 500,000 and 1 million fewer jobs in the economy than if we vote to stay. Treasury's figures are actually slightly higher than ours. You may have seen the figure in the news, 4,300 per household. LSE, Oxford Economics, all of the studies point in the same direction. And while those wishing to leave may question some of the assumptions in those studies, I think it is quite telling that the Vote Leave campaign has not produced its own economic modelling of what the economic impact would be of leaving. My guess is it would point maybe a slightly different number, slightly different assumptions, but even if you put the best case assumptions into the economic models, it tells you the same story, that there would be a price to pay. The economy would in effect be permanently smaller than if we choose to remain. So can we afford to leave the EU was the question. Well, yes, ultimately it wouldn't destroy us, but why would we want to pay that price for very little gain? Thanks.
Thanks for that, Andy, and in particular, a lot to think about in terms of trade if we were to leave. I'm going to open it up now for questions. Just so we can, I'm sure lots of people will have questions, just so we can get through as many contributions as possible. It'd be grateful if you would keep your questions to questions rather than lengthy statements, and then hopefully everyone that wants to contribute can. So first of all, we've got a lady over there, in the black jacket. And then there's the chap here at the front, and then there's a lady there in the red T-shirt. Have we got a mic or anything? No. Okay. So just project your voice. Perhaps stand and project.
What?
Thank you. Do I need to repeat anything?
Fine.
But my question is, because a lot of the people who are undecided seem to be not trusting either campaign to give them accurate and fair information on the pros and cons of leaving and remaining. And there seems to be a lot of demand out there for almost something impartial. And I just wanted to know what the panel's view about that was, because that seems to be something that a lot of people are saying to me.
Thank you. The chap at the very front here,
Barry Kendler, Harrow East Labour Party, and a councillor for Edgware Ward. You've got 3 discussion groups on the EU, 5 later on this afternoon for broad topics. And what is missing, we've got this one on the economy, is immigration. And I'm going to raise that because I think the economic arguments most pundits accept are sound to stay, and I'm voting to stay, but immigration is our weakness, it's our weak flank. Absolutely. And I represent a ward and an area with a growing number of Eastern European migrants and the established communities, many of them Gujaratis, many of them white, working class. They are inclined to vote leave because they feel our government under Blair and Brown and this government have done nothing to represent their problems. And if we're going to challenge the issue of immigration head on, how it undercuts wages, how it's a growth factor for rogue landlords, how it is putting pressure on our services with inadequate government grants to support those services. Unless we, Labour, and we, the Pro-Europe campaign, address that honestly, instead of what I see, oh, we mustn't talk about immigration. We're nice middle-class people. We must run away from that. It won't wash. We have to address it, and we have to deal with it, or God forbid, on the 23rd of June, we'll lose.
Thanks, Barry.
Thanks. Mary Wimbury, former general election candidate and Welsh Assembly candidate in North Wales. I was struck by a couple of things that the panel said on this issue. Firstly, Wes saying, you know, it's about jobs and you can convince people because they're going to lose their jobs otherwise. My experience, unfortunately, is that too often people don't believe that. Yeah. And I think one of the issues is how we counter that. And it comes back to something that John said about whether it's a head or a heart argument. And I just wondered if the panel think there is more potential for making a heart argument around compromise, working together, collective action, etc., within Europe, within the world, which ought to come down to Labour values. But I have another question as well, which is, I think part of that is about something that's entered our political discourse, and we've seen it right across the political spectrum, and it's about not being interested in facts, statistics and evidence. And we see that with Donald Trump, we saw it with Cybernats, we see it in the hard left as well. And actually, it may be too late for this campaign, but is there a way of getting this discourse back? Because I perhaps foolishly got involved in a discussion with someone last week, looking at the election results and looking at statistics. And she said, well, you've got a different view to me, so you're bound to quote different statistics. And actually, we ought to be able to be at a place where we can interrogate the same statistics and the same evidence and actually work out what's best within our values. And is there a way of moving that discourse on?
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask the panel to respond briefly to points that have been made. I'm going to go to Andy, first of all.
Okay. Well, perhaps if I take actually the question around immigration
Sure.
and leave others to talk about sort of, you know, trust and the way in which the arguments are put. I mean, look, on immigration, it is certainly, I agree with the gentleman, was it Barry? Sorry, Barry's point that this is a central component of the debate. In some ways, I think the referendum is going to come down to a choice that people make of whether they accept the economic benefits of remaining in, and immigration as, in inverted commas, a price worth paying for those economic benefits, or whether they're prepared to accept broadly an economic hit in order to, as they see it, gain control of the borders. I think that's the fundamental question of the way the referendum will shape up. So I agree we have to tackle that issue of immigration head on, having, I think, broadly won the argument that the economic benefits are on the side of remaining in. Look, there is clearly a cultural challenge around immigration. I think we have to accept that it puts pressure on local services, that some communities feel vulnerable and threatened. But I do think we have to challenge this argument around the economics of it. Immigration is an economic positive. Most businesses gain a benefit, particularly from free movement of people. It allows them to plug skills gaps, run their businesses in an efficient way that actually preserves employment back in the UK. The vast majority of migrants from Eastern Europe are net contributors to the exchequer. They're people of working age population. They are go-getting in the sense that they've been willing to move to work in the first instance. They often don't have children, draining, if you like, public services in terms of pressure on the education system, often are not bringing elderly relatives, putting pressure on the health service, but are coming here to work, in work, paying tax, which funds those services for the rest of the population. While I'd accept a sort of a business role in needing to upskill the UK population, ensure that people here are able to compete jobs, that's something that business and government need to work together on, it is important to recognise that net economic contribution. And the last point I'd make is, it is something, free movement, that cuts both ways. Yes, there are a couple of million European citizens coming to the UK to live and work. There's nearly a couple of million, 1.8 million UK citizens living in the European Union. I think it is important that we tell this story as a two-way street of free movement that gives lots of opportunities to people in the UK as well as those in perhaps Eastern Europe coming to the UK to work.
Thanks for that, Andy. Seema, do you want to deal with Rachel's point about impartial information being made available?
Yes, I want to make one broad point and then and deal with that as well. If I take Rachel's point first, there is a real issue about the quality of information available, actually, because we've never really asked some of these questions before, and the trust of the messenger. If I just take that first point, since the start of this campaign, one of the things I've been saying is we've got to get a language and a debate around these issues that feels much closer to home. It's got to feel like it's about family life. It's about the costs of, whether it's food or it's standards, or what are the benefits for families today? Because people don't feel connected to Europe. It feels far too far away. So some of what we're now talking about in terms of reform of roaming charges and what that could mean, that's very attractive to young people. It's about what difference it's going to make to me and my family. And we haven't been able to get a message across. It's been far too macro. I think we're getting better as we're asking those questions. However, if we look at the point about the messenger, well, let me give you an illustration. I was at a Tech City London First event a couple of days ago where the big message was, if you want people to vote to stay in, you've got to tell them directly too, because I'll be the first to acknowledge people don't trust politicians to be telling the truth, even when we are, which it is true a lot of the time. But the idea that you can just have impartial information, I think, is also a bit of a challenge, because if you go to, if you look at any debate about where people are influenced, it is by a combination of facts and beliefs. But sometimes in an imperfect world where some of the information is a bit more about the art rather than the science of explaining the benefits, you won't get what is kind of the holy grail. So people have to trust, and it does come down a lot to emotion, which is why this is a much more complex debate. But if people hear arguments from people like them, whether it is young people talking to other young people, or women talking to other women, or ethnic minorities talking to ethnic minorities as well, we've got to provide more of the tools, but also the access to this debate. I do believe we haven't been providing access to this debate very much, and I'll give one illustration of that, which is ethnic minority members of my constituency who don't feel that they've been connected. And I believe we've got a quantum leap to make in terms of saying we're not just talking to the establishment media all the time. We've got to be talking through a range of media, social media, in diverse ways in order to reach and engage people far more effectively. But I want to make one final broad point about where I believe that we have been failing in this debate to differentiate two important things. The first is to recognise that there are ways in which many have lost out as a result of globalisation and change. You just need to look at any range of statistics over the last 10 or 15 years of the economy, the rise in globalisation. The rich have done better. Middle class, some statistics about America, people in the kind of middle classes, their income, house income was they're about 4% worse off. The poorest are around 9% worse off. So there is a growing divide, an economic divide, a rising inequality that we have to address as politicians. The problem is who then is blamed for that and where people see the answer. We haven't been fast enough to respond in terms of our politics to recognise that, and that is now becoming a mainstream issue. But the fault doesn't lie with the European Union, which actually in many ways is part of the solution for us. And so to see that you can sort of blame the other, it is now creating a false debate where people think to leave the European Union is going to suddenly become the saviour for the other social and economic problems that we face today. We have to be far better at saying that isn't going to be the case, or we are going to have even more problems to deal with the consequences that could be rising social discord, and that is will be far greater issues for us to deal with. But I'll close by one illustration where I believe this is also creating a false argument that's going around and we are nowhere near addressing. I'll give this illustration from my constituency, but it's relevant to the points we've been raising. South Asian community, where they have been unfairly, as well as others, treated by the Tories' immigration rules, in my opinion. Look at the EU immigration and freedom of movement and say, if I vote to stop that, it's going to lead to an opening of fairer doors to people like me and my family and others. It is assuming that the Tories are going to change immigration rules because suddenly there'll be a kind of a way of stopping what's coming from Eastern Europe. It is an absolutely false argument, and I believe we have to now engage with what people are talking about and those false arguments and those myths, because they are blaming the European Union for the unfairness of the Tory government, and we have to now be faster and better at differentiating those two.
Thanks, Seema. John, Mary picked up on your point about whether it was a heart issue or a head issue. Did you want to come back and say anything more about that?
Yeah, and I think the point I made in my first contribution was about who carries that message as well. I think that's the most important thing. Who do we believe in this debate and discussion? And it's difficult because we're starting from a situation of being behind the argument. We're not ahead of the curve on this at all. And this debate, whatever happens on the 23rd of June, and hopefully I'm hopeful we'll get a positive result. The Labour movement, the industrial wing of the Labour movement, the political wing of the Labour movement has to take this argument on, has to continue with that discussion and make the case for the EU. We need to stop talking about immigration and start talking about crap employers. That's the point. You know, it's not where people are from, it's how they're being treated and how people are being undermined. And I think that's a big issue. And we need, there's a huge space for us here to have this discussion. The unfortunate thing, the circumstances are absolutely ripe just now. Whatever way you look at things, we are 8 years into people feeling less economically viable, connected. They're disenfranchised for lots of reasons. Since the financial crisis, people don't feel the way that they felt before that. And that's an issue. But it's also a challenge for the Labour Party, it's a challenge for the Labour movement, it's a challenge for trade unions, and one we need to take up. Unfortunately, in those circumstances, the heart argument comes to the fore because people start to say we could have a different way, we could do things differently. And that is clearly what happened with SNP in Scotland, it's happened with the BNP, UKIP, and other parts of the UK, where they become a sort of, you know, a collection of people who are just disengaged and unhappy with politicians more generally, and unhappy with people who make decisions. But we need to take this challenge on, because if we don't, the kind of country, the kind of communities that we want to live in and want to see won't be there. Politics that we don't agree with will be prevalent. That's the issue that we have. And I think that's something that we need to deal with. We need to get through this campaign. Everybody in this room needs to do what they can. The trade unions need to do what they can. But the other side of that, we don't just pat ourselves on the back. We actually say, look, there's a real issue here. Let's go and make change happen.
Thanks, John. Wes, did you want to say something about immigration? I know that's something that probably comes up in the doorstep in Ilford quite a bit.
It does. I represent one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse constituencies in Britain, and immigration is undoubtedly one of the top issues. And by the way, being diverse does not equal we love immigration. It may equal we came over here and we built our businesses and our families and communities. And by the way, have you seen these people coming over and who are not doing that? I think this is a real test for Labour, I think, over the course of this Parliament as to whether we're going to be brave enough to have a thoughtful debate on immigration. And there is a slight risk, including on our wing of the party, because this is probably an area where many on the left of the party and many on the centre of the party will absolutely agree and will want to talk up the economic and cultural benefits of immigration. And of course we should, because as we've seen in the European Union debate, the absence of a strong voice in favour of the European Union has now led to this position that John described, where we're weeks away from a referendum and we're asking ourselves whether we've got enough time to make the case. The problem is, and this definitely applies to our wing of the party, where I'd like to think we pride ourselves on having 2 ears and 1 mouth and using that proportion, though not always succeeding. If we listened to voters on immigration a lot earlier, we would have dealt with some of the challenges. And what was so striking about Barry's question was that it wasn't a single shred of it that was about race. It's about housing and conditions and how communities change when landlords pack people in high because they can exploit them, and then they have no sense of ownership over a community. They don't necessarily have an understanding of the rules, even as I saw in my constituency inbox yesterday, someone not knowing when to put the bins out and the problems that can cause, but also something about the jobs market itself and the race to the bottom that I was describing. And I felt that over the course of the last Parliament, we started to get there by understanding some of the root problems with immigration which aren't about race or writing people off as racist. Those people will always be there and they are racist. But most people I talk to have concerns about immigration. It's not about that at all. And even on issues like speaking English, the ability to speak English, it is not a bigoted issue to say that people who come to the country who work here should be able to speak English. It's actually a social justice issue. It does genuinely worry me, the number of people in my own constituency that I can't have a conversation with as their councillor and as their MP. Because if there is a problem behind the door, or if they do need help, who are they going to ask? And if there's an imbalance in the power relationship in the household or in the community, how do we make sure those people get access to services? And so these aren't, in my view, particularly controversial. I don't understand why we tread on eggshells, but we've got to get to the heart of the issues that Barry was describing. And finally, just on the issue of trust, because I think the two things are related. There is a lack of trust in politics because there's a lack of authenticity. And that's one of the reasons. It was great to see Mary here and Mari and other fellow key seat candidates. As well as addressing the difficult issues facing the country today, we cannot also address how it was that even just a year ago, we went to a thumping defeat in the election for a second time, and we haven't had the debate about why we lost in 2010, let alone 2015. And you would think from some of the contributions we've heard in the last week that last week's elections were some benchmark of success. The doctors are on strike, the Tories are falling apart, there are real issues in public services, we hear it on the doorstep all the time. So why aren't we romping home as a Labour Party, and why aren't people seeing us as the alternative? Why aren't people trusting our voice above all others in the European referendum debate? And if we don't ask ourselves the tough questions, we won't reach the answers to not just win the referendum, but to win crucial local elections and the next general election.
Thanks, Wes. Yeah, there's the guy in the grey sweater there, yeah. There's the woman at the front there, yeah. And there's a chap over there with a checked shirt, yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Siana Musimi from the Philosophy Department at the University of Bristol. There's a positive link between economics and security that no one in the Remain campaign seems to be making, and that is with regards to a response to Russian aggression. Now, most people in the Leave campaign, the response to Russian aggression is, well, we've got NATO and we've got America, and that's a military alliance, and that's right, but that's if it comes to that. But there are other ways of deterring aggression through economic means. You know, Simon Deckens from the Guardian said that in response to the Litvinenko inquiry, said that if David Cameron was likely to respond to Russia alone, it's likely to reveal Britain's weakness rather than strength, because Britain on its own can't really do that much. However, economic sanctions from the European Union on Russia are so significant that it would force some sort of deterrent. Now, is that link valid? Is it legitimate? Will it carry weight?
Thanks.
Hi, Rebecca. I'm chair of the Spelthorne Labour Party. There is one group of people that the polls are showing haven't really made up their minds yet, and that's women. And actually, I'm so pleased to see women like Ellie, Seema, Alison here, because they represent women going forward to stay in the EU. And I was very pleased yesterday to hear Christine speak out as well. I think We need to tell women that actually, on a business level, they can't afford to leave the EU because the EU has protected important things such as our maternity rights. And maternity rights are important for women going forward in business, and business needs more women. So how do we get that message across to women? It's not a hearts issue, it's actually also a heads issue.
Hi, Leon Spence. I'm a county councillor in Leicestershire. We saw a bizarre poster put out this week by the Leave EU campaign, which said it's not about the economy, stupid, it's about sovereignty. For a few people, sovereignty is a big issue, and I suppose the question to the panel is, what is the logical counter on that sovereignty argument? 'Cause so far, I haven't seen that there is a clear one.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, Seema, do you want to respond to Rebecca's question, particularly about how we can convince women to vote to stay in Europe?
Yes, absolutely. I think it is absolutely vital that we find ways in which we start to reach women in this campaign. I mean, we know from all the research how much women are more likely to be put off by this Punch and Judy politics that we're seeing. It is absolutely right. It's about protecting our workers' rights, maternity, paternity rights and pay, and all those fundamental underpinnings, also equal pay, which are there to protect and make sure we have our own legislation here. The idea that things won't change and things won't start to whittle away if you have people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, who have a greater voice in our politics, people who I think have made their views quite clear when it comes to the NHS and the preference for privatisation as well, Dominic Cummings and others. We have to say the world won't stay as it is. But I know that from women I've talked to, they are concerned as well about jobs for their children, their grandchildren. And it comes back as well to this intergenerational divide where it's easier to think, you know, my life is all right and it won't affect me that much to leave. But when it comes down to what's it going to mean for my children and my grandchildren too, that's where also a message can reach, and it's important that we make that case about where's the prosperity going to come from in the future. Harriet's also given a really good kind of intervention on this week, and that is worth everybody looking at in terms of how she's outlining the case for women for staying in the EU. But if I can make one final point as well, when we talk about security in our nation and the world of aggression as we see it today, in a world where we're seeing 1 billion plus people nations, and we're looking at the threat and the potential of that threat from Russia, pushing the boundaries in terms of aggression, I would far rather be in a European Union where we've got 500 million people in a bloc working together for the power and influence that will bring on the world stage than simply retreating to what will end up being the case of Little England.
Thanks, Seema. Wes, do you want to come in on the question about sovereignty?
Yeah, and I think that sovereignty and security are linked, and it follows on from what Seema said, really. When this issue comes up on the doorstep, because, by the way, I think the sovereignty, we want control over all of our own decisions argument, it's the only argument Leave have really got. I know Tales from the Treasury Committee is never going to be a bestseller, but during our EU inquiry, every single time we've had the Leave campaign in front of us, they have failed to offer any sort of credible alternative. Boris Johnson even sat in front of us and said there is no economic argument for remaining in the European Union, and when challenged on his evidence, couldn't provide any. It is about saying to people that power in the world is shifting and actually tapping into some of the legitimate cynicism people have, not just about foreign powers that might threaten us and, Russian aircraft that buzz our airspace, but also about the power of corporations and the way in which power is shifting away from nation states. And at a time when other countries are working together to tackle the big issues of the day, whether it's security or climate change or economic justice, we've got to be part of that club on issues like tax and banking reform, for example, and tax havens. Only through international cooperation can we make a difference. And the voters aren't stupid. They really aren't. You can have a conversation with people on the doorstep and people will get it. And on this issue, more than any other, I've found people are willing to have a conversation. And we've just got to make the argument and paint that bigger picture of the kind of world that people want to live in.
Thanks, Wes. John, I just wondered whether it might be worth hearing sort of the union perspective on kind of engaging with women. Obviously, we've got lots of female members of unions and linking in with the workers' rights, particularly women's rights.
Absolutely. I think it's a massive challenge for us more generally because I think people across the board don't believe that pension rights and holidays and all these sort of things are, things that we benefit from because being part of the European Union. People don't appreciate that. And that becomes a much more difficult problem to deal with when you're talking about women in particular. And women are absolutely vital in terms of this campaign because of the role that they play in terms of decision making. And I know this from my own, but 2 daughters who are hugely, not because of me, hugely engaged in the world these days. Through social media, family in the States that they speak to every day on FaceTime, all this sort of stuff. So young people, young women in particular, they have a completely different view of this. And the challenge to us is to make sure that they then go and vote on the 23rd of June. And I think that's a massive, massive issue if we don't get that right. These are people who are global. They understand the world as it is. And the big problem we do have as people who, I was just describing them as a baby boomer generation who maybe don't remember the Second World War, were born after that, and this is men and women who, looking at polls, looking at their views of things, focus groups, they don't see the value in the European Union, and I think that's hugely worrying. They don't see value in the context of the economic argument, and they're not convinced by the argument of security in Europe as well, which I think touches on some of the other earlier questions that we had. Yes, I think if you have a look at the lessons that we learned from the referendum in Scotland, the women, and not just the fact that they vote, but the role that they play more widely in terms of ensuring that people have a genuine discussion and debate about things, are absolutely vital to this debate going forward. But, we've got 4 weeks, 5 weeks. It's a massive, massive challenge for us.
Thanks, John. Andy, do you want to deal with the question about security?
Yeah, no, happy to. I think there is a link between the EU as a primarily economic bloc and actually the security challenges that the continent of Europe faces. You talked about Russian aggression in the east, in Ukraine, but obviously Daesh, ISIS in the Middle East and North Africa, and the concomitant refugee crisis that has precipitated. So Europe has a range of geopolitical challenges that it faces. And it is important, the EU as an economic bloc in rising to those. I think it's not a coincidence historically that the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It was the European Union, not NATO, that actually was crucial to the successful transition of a number of totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe into what we would recognise, broadly speaking, as sort of westernised liberal democracies. So I think that the economic strength of Europe as a bloc and its ability to rise to some of those current security challenges are indeed inextricably linked. Could I just make a couple of quick points on the other issues, just the sovereignty question? I think rather like immigration, it's really important that we do take the sovereignty issue head on. People are trying to define sovereignty on the Leave side as, if you like, the ability to take a decision for yourself. I think sovereignty is the ability of a country to get the outcomes that are in its national interest. And the European Union is, quite deliberately an exercise in pooling sovereignty in order to magnify the influence that the United Kingdom would have as just one country. And I think we do have to be upfront about that. That is what we are doing. And I think at the same time as doing that, we can make the point in all the issues that really matter to people, national defence, the tax system, the education system, what we're inculcating our young with, you know, the health service, all of those areas, actually the United Kingdom Parliament, the Westminster Parliament remains sovereign. It is primarily in the economic space for the business benefits that I talked about in my opening remarks that we choose to pool sovereignty and agree on one set of rules and standards. So I do think we have to take that issue head on. And just one last little point on women. My boss, the first female Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, Carolyn Fairbairn, if she was here, I know that she would say that it is actually quite a male-dominated debate. I'm sorry to say, particularly on the sort of, you know, on the business side, it is white men of a certain age, you know, making the arguments. And she would say, don't let this be dominated by men and end up being a male decision. Jobs and prosperity are every bit as much a women's issue as they are a men's issue.
Thanks, Andy. We've got time for a very quick final round of questions. Yeah, there's a woman in the black jacket there. Yeah. There's the chap in the black jumper there. Yeah. And there's a guy at the back there in the navy jacket.
Hi, I'm Anna. I live in Hackney, and I'm proud to say that I'm a nurse in the NHS. One of the things I wanted to talk about was actually, I don't know who anyone thinks is actually working as nurses in the NHS at the moment, but it's predominantly nurses from Europe. And I think that's been very much not recognised. And I think going back to Wes's point about what we to say on the doorstep is very much about linking people's personal lives to what's happening generally within Europe and the benefits we've got. And to say that the nurses... you know, we shouldn't be in this position. We should have our own grown nurses, but we are because we've had the NHS disseminated at the moment by the current government. But there's something positive to say about how Europe has had a positive impact and that we've been able, because of the ease of people being able to move across states within Europe to come over to the UK, that we have actually got people looking after our friends and family at the moment. And it's an absolute credit that we've got those European nurses in the NHS.
Thank you. Yeah, the guy there.
Hi there, Patrick. I'm chairman of Hyde Park branch around the corner. People say that graduates are the most likely people to vote Remain. But there are a couple of other communities out there that might be even more enthusiastic. In particular, our friends and family in Ireland, Spain, Italy, places like that. There are hundreds of thousands in each country. What are the employers, what are the trade unions, what is the party apparatus doing in order to ensure that, one, they know if they can vote, two, how do they do it between now and 6 weeks away, and what are we doing to persuade them? Lots of them may well be Conservative voters who've moved to France a few years ago, got a nice property out there like Nigel Lawson and people like that. And loads of people who've gone out there for work. So there's loads of votes for staying in there. The other community that may well be very positive to voting Remain is the gay community. We've got loads of benefits from Europe, and I think we've got loads of friends in Europe. We travel more, we're more likely to vote. So I think the party and the different campaigns need to make those points as well. So how can each of those organisations ensure that people in Europe know if they can vote, how they can vote, and what we're going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim Carter. I don't represent anyone apart from myself, but just a quick question. It's about, can Britain afford to be outside the EU? I think we're now, if you like, suffering the consequences of years of treating Europe as a third-rate issue. Where are our MEPs? Where are MEPs at election time? We only see them on seaside tours or tucked away where they can't do any damage. So that's the first point. But the other point now is we're in a real difficulty because we don't know where the vote is. Getting out the vote on a campaign is essential to any campaign. And because we've neglected Europe so long, we've never asked the question because we're too uncomfortable with it, because it's all about Westminster, if you like, or if it's not about Westminster, it's about Nick Forbes in Newcastle. It's never about our MEPs or what they deliver. So the question is, can Labour actually change our relationship with Europe and take it seriously after this referendum?
Thanks very much. We've only got 4 or 5 minutes before the end of the session, so I am simply going to ask each of our panellists just to do a 1 minute maximum roundup. Andy, do you want to start off? We'll work down the line.
Well, look, I'll leave Labour representatives to ask Tim's question. I mean, I agree with Anna about the importance of free movement. I touched on that earlier to public services. But just Patrick's question around, what can employers do to encourage registration? Certainly the CBI has encouraged all of its members to actively promote registration, not necessarily take a side, although many of our members will and are doing that, but just to encourage registration and democratic participation, including, with lots of our members are international businesses in one way or another, encouraging overseas registration. I believe the deadline is next week for overseas electors to register, so before the final deadline for UK-based citizens to register, but we are doing our bit on that.
Wes?
We're relying really heavily on demographic data and mosaic data as opposed to hard responses, which is going to make knocking up really interesting on polling day. There are, broadly speaking, 2 categories of people. There's the persuasion pool and there's the GOTV pool. So in my constituency, I'm going to spend a lot of time, particularly through direct mails rather than door-to-door. I can't physically, even with my door knockers, get to every voter in Ilford North between now and the election. And I'll also be working with local Conservatives and Liberal Democrats to try and get the vote out on the day as well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that.
Seema?
Thanks very much. I would just close with this, which is this is such an important issue now. Don't leave it to somebody else. If there's something that needs doing, I think it's now for all of us to say, what can I do to make it happen? And I'll illustrate that with the Tech City event this week, where they took on that responsibility to say to ourselves, what do we do? Because if people are going to listen, if we want our voice heard, it is about their voice. And so my message to them was, it's all about you now as well, and not just about us. I do get very concerned, however, with the fear of speaking out. And just was one business I was talking to this week, they know it's in their interest, their employees' interest, this country's interest to stay in. They're afraid of saying so because they're already threatened by vote leave. Yep. And they have said to me privately, they know there are thousands of jobs they're already planning to cut in the UK, but they cannot say so. So this is now really a point where it's up to everybody now to speak out and not be perpetuating that climate of fear. And just to say, I think it's all in the balance. I think we can do it. I think it's going to be close. And I'll be doing everything I can between now and then, and I'm sure you will, to make that outcome remain.
John.
My community is a relatively small trade union, but we're not just going to rock up on a week before the referendum and say, vote this way. We've built a relationship with our members over a period of time about the Labour Party. We talk positively and constructively about our relationship with the Labour Party and politics more generally. So our members will hopefully, regardless of our size, the density of people who will turn out and vote in the way that we want them to will be there, and I'm confident in that because of that relationship that we've built up over a period of time. But we do have a challenge. I spend my time with, most of my time, spare time, with normal people. And what I mean with normal people, people who wouldn't be here on a Saturday morning. And they want to see a positive leadership from the Labour Party on the EU referendum. They're not seeing that just now, if I'm being honest. They want to see a Labour Party that's credible and constructive, and unfortunately that's not where we're at, and that's the biggest challenge that we face as a wider organisation as we head to June the 23rd.
Thanks very much. I think that was a really useful session and certainly lots to think about. Thank you all for your contributions. I'm sorry we weren't able to take more, but I think it was a really good discussion with the panellists, so thanks very much for taking part.